Now that you've completed activities 1 through 5, we're just about ready to begin working on the Hero Shot assignment. There are just 2 more tools that you need to know before we begin. Now, the images that you need for this assignment can be located in your content browser under the image bank, and those files are called candy, hair products, beverages, and snacks. As you open the selection that you want to work with, you want to take a look at the selection tools and find the one that best suits the composition that you're working with. In this case, I've used a variety of different selection tools, adding and subtracting until I have a perfect outline of the item that I want to copy. I've also decided to open up the Tropicana orange juice because I've chosen that I'd like to use both the oranges and the orange juice in this particular hero shot. Now, since I've already done the selections, I'm ready to actually begin creating my document. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to click File, New, and I've got the New Document dialog box. To make it a little bit easier, I'm going to convert from pixels to inches, and I'm going to create a poster size document. So my width is going to be 13 inches wide by 10 inches in height. I'm going to make my resolution 300 pixels per inch. I'm going to keep my color mode RGB 8-bit, and I'm going to have a white background. I'm going to click OK. I now have a brand new white canvas to work from, and I can begin copying the elements that I want to include in my composition. To copy and paste, it's Control-C or Command-C for copy, and I'm going to paste, Control-V or Command-V to paste. I'm going to repeat this process, Control-C, Control-V. I now have the items that I want to work with on my canvas. They clearly need to be resized. There's also some adjustments that I want to do to this, as well as some of the clone tool to perfect some of the imperfections that I'm seeing in the product. Let's first begin by resizing the documents that I'm working on. So layer 2 is what I have selected. I want to right click and convert to Smart Object. I want to go to layer 1. I want to right click and convert to Smart Object. I'm now ready to start resizing my document. I want to make sure that I'm on the Move tool. I want to click on Layer 1, and now I can move and resize the document. It's much easier to work from an image if you can see the whole thing. So I'm going to Shift while I'm resizing to maintain the aspect ratio. I'm going to drag from the corners and resize the object. This doesn't have to be my final size. This is just a starting point so that I can see where I'm working from. I'm going to click Enter to accept those changes. I'm going to click on Layer 2 and do the same thing. I'm going to accept this change, and I'm ready to start working on my adjustments layers. Now, there are actually 2 ways to affect adjustments in Photoshop. The first way is to go over here to the Image drop-down menu and to go into Adjustments there. This adjustments area here allows you to make adjustments to your document, but what it does is it's affecting the pixels in the image, and so it's a very destructive way to work. The better way to work is to actually go to the Adjustments panel over here on the right hand side. Now, before I close the image drop down, I want to show you that you'll see that there's a great deal of similarities between the choices you have here, brightness level, curves, exposure, and so on, and what you have here, brightness, levels, curves, exposure, and so on. So each one of these tools works pretty much the same way as these do, but what's different here is that instead of adjusting the pixels, for each one of these adjustments that I select, it's going to create a new layer. Each adjustment layer then can be turned on and off so that I can see the before and after of each adjustment. It allows me to delete an adjustment layer that I don't like, or I can take an adjustment layer and just like any other layer, I can decrease or increase the opacity if I want to increase or decrease the effect of that particular adjustment. So this affords me a lot more flexibility, and I can do a lot more mistakes as I'm learning how to apply adjustments. Let's begin by looking at this first adjustment tool here, the Levels. The Levels tool looks a little bit like a crown. It's on the top row of icons. This is the one that I want to work on first. Now, you'll notice that when I clicked on the adjustments level here for levels, I've got nothing in my histogram. And that's because this particular item is placed above my background. There are no pixels on my background, so there's nothing in this panel. If I click and drag it up a level, I can see that it's now above my layer 1. Now I've got a histogram that relates to layer 1, which is the pitcher of orange juice. What a histogram is this mountain of pixels here. It's essentially a map of all the pixels in every color found from dark to light in this image. Now whenever you see a histogram like this mountain will look different depending on the image that you're looking at. And of course, depending on exposure, you may have more dark pixels than light pixels. That's exactly what we're seeing here. This side here of the mountain are the details in the shadows. On this side, we have the details in the highlights. And in the middle, you have the mid-range, the mid-tone of all of your pixels. In order to have the perfect exposure, you want to have a representation of all the values from shadows and midtones to highlights. My highlights end here. This can be very quickly resolved in Photoshop. All I need to do is to take the clippings, which are easily moved, by clicking and dragging and dropping. Now I have a perfectly exposed picture. Now I've affected the highlights and the shadows by moving the clippings, but I haven't affected the midtones. The midtones can be adjusted using the curves. Now all of these can be personalized, but Photoshop allows you to do things the quick and easy way simply by clicking on some of the automatics. So here I have an automatic curve adjustment, and Photoshop is going to do the hard work for me, and when I click automatic, it's going to affect the midtones. Now that the curves and the levels have been adjusted for layer 1, I can actually wink on and off those adjustments to see what they'd look like before and after. Now that's fine, I've done this for this layer, but what I'd like to do is I'd like to include layer 2 in that equation. You'll notice that layer 2 has not been affected. Watch what happens when I click, drag and drop layer 2 down beneath. You will notice that now the effects for those layers include both layer 1 and layer 2. Now I can continue with some of my other effects or some of my other adjustments. Let's take a look at vibrance. Vibrance is this inverted triangle here, and this is going to create a different kind of adjustments layer. Now vibrance works by allowing you to increase or decrease the intensity of the muted colors within your composition. So as I bump up the vibrance, it's really subtle because in this case I really don't have too many muted colors, but you can particularly see it up here in these bubbles. So as I'm going up and down, you will notice the difference. Now if I don't like that effect, I can either wink on and off to see what it looks like before or after, or I can double click on vibrance and it's going to return it to 0. Vibrance in this particular case, the changes are very subtle. Saturation, however, is going to be a much more dramatic effect as I move the slider up and down, because saturation allows you to increase or decrease the intensity of all of the colors. So as I bump it up, you'll notice that the intensity becomes much greater. This orange almost becomes red, and so that is far too intense. I'm going to double click on saturation and return it down to 0. Now it works the same way if you're working in the opposite direction. In fact, if I go all the way down the opposite direction, I end up with a black and white, almost a black and white image. So that's clearly not what I'm looking for, but that's typically how saturation and vibrance can be affected. In this case, I'm going to bump up the vibrance just a little bit. I'm going to bump down the saturation just a tad, and I'm going to keep it like this. Now this is an entirely aesthetic choice on your part, and so you have to make changes, affect changes in the way of your adjustments that are going to work for the product that you're working with. All right, let's take a look at another effect. This next effect I want to talk about is the camera filter effect. That's this tool right here. It's called New Photo Filter Adjustment Layer, and it's a camera with a little circle in front of it. If you can imagine in the days of film photography, what photographers would often do is they would place a glass filter in front of the lens of the picture when they were taking their pictures. That glass filter would be colored, and it would cause your images to have a very different shift in the mood or the temperature. So let's take a look at what this could do to your composition. You can add warming filters, cooling filters, or filters of a specific color. In fact, let's take a look at what it looks like if I go to a warming filter 81. Here's the change. It's a subtle one. Let's take a look at cooling filter 82. You can see that all of a sudden the label on my orange juice has become more blue in tone. It's become a little cooler. This might help communicate the idea that this product is a nice cold product. Or you might just not like that effect. Here are some other looks that you could go with. A red or an orange filter. A cyan filter. Sepia to make it look a little bit older. Deep emerald or yellow, and underwater. Now these filters are subtle. You can change the density. Anytime you want to delete a layer, you make sure that you're on the layer that you want to delete. You click the delete button and you just accept that change. And you'll notice that now I no longer have that layer to work with. So that's just one of the many things that you can do. Here's another great layer that you can do, and this is something that perhaps for this project you don't need, but often we convert pictures to black and white. And this is a great way to do it without making a permanent change to an image. So if I click on this very middle button here, the black and white adjustment, you can see here that I've changed this image to black and white. If at any time I want to go back to color, delete the layer, yes. The next tool that we can talk about is hue and saturation. While hue and saturation itself looks a little bit confusing, it allows you to do things like colorize your image. So if I wanted to, that really doesn't look pleasant, but I could colorize an image. One other thing that I want to show you is the presets. Now there's some really great effects that you can have if you want to play around with the presets. Right now it's on custom default, but let's say for example I wanted to play around and I wanted to see what it would look like as a cyanotype. Well, it doesn't really work for orange juice. But there's all kinds of different presets that might be worth experimenting with, like increasing the saturation just slightly. Here's another preset, old style. If I wanted to advertise this in a sort of 50s way, this would be a really interesting selection because it does all of a sudden make my product look a little more old-fashioned-y. Let's take a look at some of the others. There's red boost, sepia, strong saturation, and yellow boost. Now these may not work for your product. You always have to play around and see what works and see what you like. I kind of like that yellow boost. I'm actually liking the way that that looks, but it's entirely up to you. Now one thing that you can do with something if you like it but you think wow that's really intense, I can go over here to the opacity and I can decrease the opacity of that particular effect, and you can notice that as I'm doing that it's not as intense as it once was. So now I have a 50% opacity on this particular hue with a yellow boost. Now let's take a look at some of these panels. Let's wink them on and off and see how they look and see how it was when we first began. This is our before image, and now I can start playing around and seeing how things might have been improved upon as we started working. Go ahead and do some experimentation of your own. Think about which adjustments might work for your product. And of course, at any time, you can adjust the saturation, the opacity. You can also delete layers, wink them on and off, and see what they look like before and after.